Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Luce Hall on the yard of the U.S. Naval Academy for the closing day of the Ethics Across the Curriculum and the Yard Workshop 2023. I'm Jeff McCrease. I'm the Deputy Director of the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, and it's our honor here to have you all join us here in person and in cyberspace for our final presentations. This is the fourth annual workshop, and as we did in the very first time we held this at the beginning of the COVID pandemic in 2020, the goal of this workshop is to bring people together from across the yard to study the curriculum of the leadership sequence of courses, with special emphasis on our ethical presentation in the way we present any 203 or moral reasoning course for the military officer, with the goal being that our participants will take a knowledge of the way we teach ethics and apply them to their own discipline, whether it's in the academic classroom or in the sports field or in Bancroft Hall. So today, we ought to note that this is a joint presentation of the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, the Naval Academy Center for Teaching and Learning, and the Naval Academy's Leadership Education and Development Division. And as well, this workshop is made possible through a generous grant from the Robert and Mary Looker Foundation, as well as the Noggle and Ingersoll family. So to review what our learning outcomes, learning objectives for the workshop were, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Doug Rao, one of Leeds' distinguished professors. Please.
All right, well, thank you very much. And with the conversation and the effort of our faculty members who are here and the ones who gave presentation, we hope at the conclusion of this workshop, each of the participants will be able to, one, comprehend the basic principles and the sequence of key leadership themes from the Naval Academy leadership courses. That was presentations by our different faculty members in lead. Comprehend the basic principles of moral reasoning as taught by in NE 203, which is our moral reasoning and ethics course for the naval leader. 3, construct effective learning outcomes related to ethical content in a course or discipline for their course or their discipline. 4, develop curriculum content that integrates the ethics, what we have in NE 203, into an academic discipline. And 5th, to collaborate with key influencers across the different disciplines to confront the shared challenges of incorporating ethical issues into their academic curriculum.
Thanks very much, Professor. Next, we'd like to turn it to Professor Mark McWilliams from the English department to review very briefly the schedule of events and the content of the 5-day workshop. Professor.
So here you see how we spent the last 5 work days together. This is basically the format the workshop has followed since its inception, with some improvements and tweaks over the years. On the first day, we began with this introduction of participants and of facilitators. There are a bunch of people involved in making this happen. There was an overview of the leadership course sequence involving the coordinators of each of those courses or someone who teaches in them, giving us an overview of how they would link together. And then we had a presentation on accreditation and how ethics plays a role in the requirements of AVET, the American Chemical Society, and Middle States, and the way our programs and institutions are accredited. On the second day, we focused really entirely on ethics with a series of presentations and case studies providing a broad overview of moral reasoning as it's taught in NE 203 in the youngster year. On the third day, we began actually with a workshop on technology that focused this year on the ethical concerns that might be raised by the use of generative AI. After that, we had a workshop on constructing and assessing effective learning outcomes. And then there was time for individual work on projects, which was the entire focus of the 4th day, which offered participants time both to work on their projects on their own, to collaborate with each other, but there were also a group of 7 or 8 people from various fields and various parts of the academy who were available for consultation that participants could turn to. And the 5th day, today, we're having these presentations and open discussion of the work that's been done, and looking forward to hearing from everyone.
Thanks very much, Professor. So the majority of today's proceedings are final project presentations from our 6 participants, and we'd like to start first with Dr. Sofi Loomis, USNA graduate and an NE 203 instructor. Please.
Next slide, please. Thank you so much. Good morning. My name is Dr. Sofi Loomis, and the lens that I bring and experience is that I'm a 1999 grad, and I'm prior enlisted surface warfare officer. I'm a NAPSter, varsity athlete at Navy, was at an ECA and Glee Club. Also coached here at Navy cross country, and former adjunct here for NE 203. The project here is Everyday Ethics on and off the yard. The project is designed to help midshipmen and staff learn and practice ethics on a daily basis. The outcomes is that the Naval Academy midshipmen will actually demonstrate ethical practices of human dignity and respect on and off the yard. The project will evaluate the on the yard and off the yard practice of ethics, and the proposed midshipman groups that will be determined by key personnel on campus, proposed ECAs, company, or battalion. And the project duration will be semester or, and it will be continuous depending on the project development. As far as the learning outcomes, the first learning outcome is to learn and identify the human value and dignity. The second is to learn about caring for others and service. The third is to practice an appreciation for caring for others. Fourth is to experience the outcome of caring for others. And the last one is to enhance leadership soft skills. Through our learning journey for ethics and leadership here at the Naval Academy, it complements actually applying the ethics and leadership that they learn every year. The lesson plan is to have the midshipman group that's identified to identify a volunteer project. The identification of that project will select 1 or 3 service staff members on campus, on the yard and off the yard. And that have made a positive difference in their lives. And it could be related to how, who receives the service for their respective ECA, for example. If able, the idea is to spend time with their respective staff member that they're trying to appreciate, to be alongside to understand their role. Next, to create and plan the appropriate appreciation and dedication. Fifth is to perform the staff member dedication. And last is to showcase the service appreciation project to the brigade. The timeline for it would be the summer to conduct the research actually on literature review and actually to collaborate with other military academies to see if they have any social responsibility out in the corporate world is corporate social responsibility. As they're developing, this is a learning laboratory for midshipmen, and this is the first exposure that they have to understanding what is ethics and leadership in the application. And then we'll generate a report to see if there's any other research out there, and then select a group type for the project. For the fall is to discuss a project and launch on the yard project with the respective group, and also to report on the service at the end of the semester to report on that service and report it all to the brigade. The semester, I broken it down to fall and spring. You can do on the yard for fall time, off the yard in the springtime. The assessment would develop effective metrics to collect on the yard. Perhaps it would be from USNA staff members, midshipmen themselves, and off the yard feedback with people that they interact with. And an example that I gave would be sponsors and downtown businesses. How do they interact out in town? Next steps, again, is to conduct research and discuss the project with the Stockdale Center and USNA leadership team to seek the viable group fit. Then you'd collect, after identification of the key group that you're trying to help, in a sense, to practice ethics, you would collect their core documents that they have as guidance for their program. Again, example would be for an ECA, some of our clubs that are out there to see how are they interacting with each other, what are their social responsibilities, if any, at this time. And then also another example that in a brainstorming session was to talk about what do they do on a daily basis, and that would be daily watch standing. They have watch to stand. How do they interact with their fellow, even midshipmen, their peers, and the folks that they have to report to, and how they impact others. And then lastly, connecting with the key personnel on the yard and off the yard as a working group to determine what are the suitable metrics, and again, to identify what's the right group to start practicing ethics on the yard with each other and off the yard, so they can become actually wonderful officers that take care of their people and take care of each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Loomis. Our next presentation is from Professor Howard Ernst from the Naval Academy Political Science Department. President?
All right, so the title of my presentation is Ethics and Environmental Radicalism from the Affect Domain. So a boring title, but I'm going to start it off with an interesting story. True story happened last night. I'm in my basement. My son's home from college. It's 9 o'clock at night, and I want to spend some time with my son. My son, I know, is upstairs. Pretty good idea what he's doing. He's on his phone, social media, hunched over in a chair. I'm downstairs in the basement, big TV down there. I need to entice him down to the basement. I try to find something on the television that's of interest to him. I see, okay, there's this movie with Seth Rogen. I like Seth Rogen. He's kind of funny. It's called Pineapple Crush. I don't know anything about that, but maybe Professor Ruth does because he's giggling at the title. And so I just say, Alexa, announce, Simon, come on downstairs. I'm watching Pineapple Crush with Seth Rogen. Intentionally vague. Seth Rogen in my basement. What am I doing? Right? And I listen. I got an old house, so I listen for the pitter patter. And I hear it. There's some rustling, pitter patter. He comes down the stairs, and I got him hooked in. He's there, right? So now he has a seat. And what I didn't realize is that Pineapple Crush is basically a polemic in favor of marijuana use. It's not a documentary, but it's a drama that presents it in a kind of funny, kind of Cheech-Chong type of way. But then there's a scene in it when Seth Rogen looks at the camera and he says, "What are we doing? All the problems we've had throughout this whole escapade that we've had are related to us being impaired because of marijuana use. The car accident, boom, 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 boom." I'm like, wow, there's something I could talk to my son about after this movie's over. Thank you, Seth. And we did. And so Seth Rogen, framed something in a way. He had credibility, and he was able to foster a discussion. I thought about something that happened earlier in that day when I was walking for exercise. I was listening to my favorite podcast. It's a Theo Vaughn podcast, another comedian. And Theo Vaughn is an alcoholic and former drug user that's in recovery, and it's part of his comedy and so on. And he tells these stories. And earlier in that day, he had another comic on, and the other comic was actually smoking marijuana while he was in the studio with Theo Vaughn. And the reason I know that is because at some point during the podcast, the other comic says, "Oh my gosh, Theo, I'm sorry. I triggered you." And Theo had taken his vape pen and actually inhaled the marijuana, and they didn't talk about that. And they went on. The podcast was just as funny as ever, and there was no implications of it. I was thinking to myself, both of those information had an effect on people, right? And one was more intentional, where Seth Rogen had thought about perhaps, what do I want to say? Okay, marijuana is this, but it also has its downside. And the other one was a guy falling out of recovery very publicly, never talking about the implications of it and what the impact that's going to have on millions of people. All that to say, what I'm trying to do with my students now is to take the affect learning objective. What are you going to understand? How is this going to impact you? And how are you going to take that seriously? And how are you not going to avoid it? And I recall this, I relate this back to myself as a professor at different stages. As a young professor at the Naval Academy, I come here, and what do? I do the same thing. I avoid affect discussions. I avoid these things because they're dangerous. They can get you in trouble, right? And so here's the U.S. Constitution. It has 3 branches, blah, blah, blah. Knowledge, 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 boring, 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 right? And so I get a little bit more mature. I say, no, I'm going to actually focus on some of the effect. I want students to value democracy at the end of my class. That's a thing, right? How am I going to do that? Okay. So I want to be objective about it. Here are the attributes of democracy and the good things. Here are the other things. And so professor number 2, I go from Professor Google, which is just the facts, to Professor Robot. Here are the pros, here are the cons, and so on. And I shake my students up by the collar and I put them back and I say, I'm not going to tell you what I believe, and I walk away. And I come to the conclusion that too is a little bit unethical and irresponsible. And so what's the alternative? The alternative to me at this point, and one of the things that this seminar is helping me understand, is that there's a third way to think about things, which is to say, how are you going to frame your questions? How are you going to make sure that students don't land where you want them to, right? You don't want them to have to take on your values, but they're going to take very seriously and they can consider these things. So can you frame questions in a way that allows them to grapple with these questions in a meaningful way? How does this relate to my class? I teach environmental politics and security at the Naval Academy. One of the things that we look at is the role and influence of radical environmentalists. These are people that are willing to break the law and use violence in some instances to pursue justifiable environmental objectives. I don't know if the violence is justifiable, but the objectives are legitimate and just, and the students relate to them. And so I come up with my learning objectives. This is what I want my students to know. I'm going to spend very little time on this. This is Professor Google. This is old professor, okay? They can Google it. They're going to do it. It's not going to take a lot of time. This is what I want them to do, but they're going to be doing these things for a reason to get to a level of understanding, okay? And so these are the learning objectives I tell my students. And then there's a fourth learning objective that's not going to be on the board on day one. And this is the framing of the class to try to get them to consider more things in a way that can maybe benefit them. So I want them to understand at the end of this, the dangers and pitfalls of radical environmentalism. Not enough just to sympathize with them. I want them to understand it. And so how do I do it? First of all, this is a 3-class sequence. So it's not one class. You can't do this in one day, right? Just like I couldn't do this presentation within my 5-minute limit. Sorry. I'm going to assign out of class the no stuff, the easy stuff, right? So here's the ethical reading. Here's the easy stuff. You're going to watch the case study outside of class. You're not going to watch a video in my class, but then you're going to come in my class and you're going to do some stuff with this. So we're going to have a graded case study discussion. You're going to be graded on your participation on this discussion. So you need to have the knowledge, and you need to be thoughtful. You need to challenge your peers in an important way. And then at the end, you're going to have a reflection piece, and this is all together new for me. You're going to be forced to consider and reflect on what we just did, what you know and did, in a way to critique the radical environmental movement. I'm not saying the radical environmental movement is wrong, but I need for you to be able to go through the thought process to understand the trials and pitfalls. So what are the assumptions of the radical environmental movement? According to Richard Rorty, the final vocabulary. What's the things that they assume to be true that they can't justify other than the fact that I believe in it? Okay, so what is that? Okay, what do you think of those things? They make sense? They resonate with you? Good. And then the second thing would be not just knowing those things. I want you to understand or think about seriously the unintended consequences. So this person believes this and did these logical things, but these bad things happen too. Well, what about that? Unintended consequences of Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber. It was a very rational, very smart, very principle-based person who blew up people and disrupted the lives of hundreds of people in the consequence of pursuing his environmental objectives. Are you able to do that? And then the last thing I want them to think about is, does it work? This is a political strategy. These people are trying to achieve something political that you might agree with. However, is it effective? Could they have done this in a better way? Better being more effective, not more ethical. So take the ethical consideration out of it. And so now they have to go through these 3 considerations. And now I don't know where they're going to land, but I'm going to know that they gave serious consideration to these things. That's it.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor. Appreciate it. Our third presentation today is from Assistant Professor Brielle Harbin from the Naval Academy Political Science Department.
It doesn't matter if we stand up or sit down.
You can say.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Brielle Harbin, Assistant Professor in the Political Science Department. So the deliverable that I created through this Stockdale experience was meant to help me solve a problem that I was confronting in a class I teach, FP 130. I'm sure everybody's probably familiar with it. And so the problem that I was trying to solve is that the course as originally designed was really having students understand and focus on having them comprehend the important role of enumerated powers, implied powers via the Constitution. But I was interested in having them also understand the important role of democratic norms. that is like the glue that keeps the system together in maintaining our democratic system. And so the context for this, I recently, after kind of all the political events of the last several years, completely revised my course to have a whole unit on democratic norms. And also, because there's a requirement of a research assignment, created a research paper that had them formulate a thesis statement that was related to the exercise of democratic norms. And so they would choose it from the perspective of one of the three branches, and then there's a list of different democratic norms. So things that aren't explicitly written in the Constitution, but are widely agreed upon ways of doing the business of US government, and formulate an argument either from using historical or contemporary examples about how individual actors' decision to adhere to or violate these democratic norms, how it impacts our system, whether it has no effect, it undermines democracy, it improves democracy. So having them craft that thesis statement. So where'd the problem come up? The problem came up because I noticed that I was having a problem with getting students to buy in to the premise of the assignment. So I know as a political scientist, we've been thinking a lot about democratic norms over the last several years. But what I saw from my perspective was that many of the students really couldn't conceptualize, have the imagination to think about American democracy as a fragile system, as something that could be impacted by the cumulative effects of individual actors or groups on the democratic system. And so because they couldn't really imagine that there could not be American democracy, what my research paper was asking them to do was actually, from their perspective, really abstract and theoretical. And so they're like, okay, I'll do it. I'll go do the library day and all of that. But they didn't care as much as, or have the same sense of urgency that I have, and then also a lot of political scientists were having about this question. And so the solution that I am bringing to this, because I want to keep the assignment. As I was thinking through, it's like, oh man, I'm reading these papers. Sometimes it's painful. I know it's painful for them to write it, so I just get rid of it. But by participating in this experience, I was thinking maybe there's a way that I can save this assignment that I think is really important. And one of the things that I've noticed is that especially as a civilian instructor, if I'm able to pull from different things that they're learning across the curriculum, that there's a buy-in because they're hearing it in multiple places, right? So invite the discussion of ethical leadership. And so this, over the last week, I've been introduced to the Moral Deliberation Roadmap, which I think provides a systematic framework for thinking about and analyzing, crafting an argument about the impact or even the decision calculus that someone might be going, kind of thinking through when they are deciding whether or not to violate or adhere to a democratic norm. So using that, introducing students to it, and creating this in-class fishbowl exercise. So I have several, this assignment is scaffolded over the entire semester. Literally the first day, I introduced them to the example, many of you might have been familiar with it, former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, former President Trump, the State of the Union thing that was all over the news about did they shake hands or not. That's a democratic norm, right? It's not written in the Constitution that you have to shake hands, but we expect our leaders to have that level of decorum with one another. So using that in the pull everywhere exercise where I have them think through, is it a big deal that, like, whether or not they shook hands or not, because I think that was speculation based on camera angles, does it matter, right? So having that introductory exercise, but then also adding this in-class fishbowl exercise where I have them introduced to a series of case studies that can come from Democrats, Republicans, from Supreme Court justices, whoever is in the political system, where they are either deciding to adhere to the democratic norm or violate it, and working in small groups to analyze what is the impact of this decision? Is there one? Right? So the learning goal here is, of course, introduce them to some of this systematic framework for thinking about moral reasoning, particularly in the context of politics, which we know is highly polarized, right? So we're providing some discipline to their thinking. And then secondly, thinking not only about large-scale decisions to violate democratic norms, but also the small ones too, and not kind of thinking about one as being more important than the other. as a way to kind of think about the impact on the stability of American political institutions. So there's three different benefits of this. One, having students actively learn, right? It's not a passive lecture that I'm giving. They're actually reading a case study. They're learning from actual people who have had leadership positions and kind of have a stake in the issue, so that they're hopefully both cognitively and affectively investing in what they're learning. And then particularly this issue of, and this applies to them in their own career journey, the idea of the impact of deciding to work around unwritten things, right? Does it always have to be written down for you to really adhere to it and care about it and think that it's important? And then secondly, providing an early opportunity for engagement about ethical leadership. So I teach Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 1, 2, 3 for the in the fall semester. So I will literally be for several students the first person that they see and get taught by. And so it'll be an opportunity for them to think about it from the very first day, very first hour of their instruction at USNA. And then third, as FP 130 is a required course here at the Naval Academy. If others want to adapt the lesson plan that I create, then FP 130 instructors, this could be something that is actually just standardized for all students who are plebes and thinking about this from the very first days here on the yard, so within the classroom. So debriefing some of the next steps, talking to my chair, who I think is here. I can see Captain Richardson. Hello. And then revising my syllabus to incorporate the NDR. One thing that I'm thinking through, and I haven't fully decided yet, is if this should be an entire unit or just a series of classes. Like, how prominently do I want to feature this in my syllabus? Because I have to make choices about that. Of course, they're the hard ones. And there's a norm in my department of having a FP 130 instructor weekly meeting in the fall semester. So contacting that person and saying, hey, can I do a presentation about this lesson plan? And hopefully Dr. McWilliams gave me the idea of inviting an instructor from NL 110 so that I can see how are you kind of foreshadowing or scaffolding what they'll learn their second year with respect to the NDR, so that I can have some continuity across their plebe year curriculum. And then taking the feedback that I get from my students, from the faculty, and then revising that lesson plan that I have created, and then just putting it on a shared drive so it's available. I'm lowering the cost of having to think about this for everybody who's teaching FP 130. I've done the work. You're welcome of doing that. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to being able to engage about this.
Thanks very much, Professor Harbin. Our next presentation is from Lieutenant Commander Justin Downs, a permanent military instructor in the Computer Science Department.
All right, thank you.
Commander, please.
Good morning, Lieutenant Commander Justin Downs. So we're starting up a new data science major, and currently the most senior of the data scientists are rising second class. So I'm teaching a class called Human Data Interaction. That's going to be given spring of second class year. So as far as where the midshipmen will be at that point, in terms of the leadership department's classes, they'll have taken the ethics class. Probably half of them will have taken their second class leadership classes, but none of them will have taken their first legal class yet. By human data interaction, one of the main pillars is the ethical use of data. So it's how data interacts with humans. So that's like the supply side of how we use people's data, also the demand side of how we present it. So I'm going to present like the main big picture course outcomes, because I think this project that I'm here for is the entire course, for the ethical part of the human data interaction course. So I'm going to talk about the big picture course learning outcomes, and then I'll talk about an example assignment that I'll plan on giving like the first week of class. So in terms of what we're looking for the course to teach the students, so I have here identify the legal and ethical considerations when developing like the data, like a data pipeline. So the collection, the analysis, and the presentation of that data. I have two different. So I talked about the legal versus the ethical. So we have a legal floor at what we can do when it comes to collecting and using data. So we have restrictions when it comes to like the Fourth Amendment, when it comes to the Privacy Act and the expectation of privacy. These minutes, the second class will not have their legal class yet, the naval law class. So A lot of this might be introduction to them, although they probably are familiar with a lot of the constitutional principles. But also, I want to get into the ethical considerations, and a lot of those, especially with the use of data, I'm going to be using what are called the free information privacy principles, or and those are like the FIPP. Those are developed by the federal government back post Watergate, and it was, how can we develop some founding principles, some ethical principles of how to use data, especially public data. So the FIPPs, this is the principles that the Privacy Act was actually built on. It's the principles that HIPAA was built on as well. So they're very well established, and as a bonus, they were developed by the federal government. So as a federal institution, I think it's very, very proper that we should be using them or taking a look at them. And this example assignment is when I'll introduce them, the midshipmen, to those principles. Also, want to talk about after you use the data, so the ethical use of data, and also the ethical display and creation of visualization. So there's ethical way, you can have a dishonest visualization. Probably all know about that. So you can either intentionally or unintentionally have that. So that's going to be a big part of the class as well. We have like the specific, so from like an effective point of view, so those are kind of cognitive learning. So from an effective, I want to take things like FOIA and look at why do we have Freedom of Information Act? How does it help? How does it serve democracy? And start from the ethical foundations and build our way up so that the midshipmen don't enter their life, or they're not jaded by something where, oh, the FOIA is a burden upon the government and it's the public doing this to us. Like, that's not our job as public servants. That's not a healthy attitude to democracy. So I want to take those federal data policies and look at those ethical foundations. And then hidden down here is sort of like a psychomotor, I guess you could say. These are all second class, so they haven't done their capstones. There have not been any data science capstones yet, so that's going to be coming, the year after this one. And so preparing them for that, I want them to go through the IRB process. So part of my next steps is to engage with the IRB team. I don't know what their capstone's going to look like. I don't know if we're going to be having anything that will require an IRB, but I don't want them to have an idea in their mind of what they want to do and be afraid of the bureaucracy or the paperwork, or have, maybe their advisor says, oh, if we do, X, Y, and Z, we don't have to trigger an IRB. We can kind of skirt our way around it, because that's not, an ethical use of, that's not how it's supposed to go. And I think a lot of the reason people do that is because they're just afraid of the unknown. So actually going through it, we're probably not going to submit 50 IRBs per semester, but I'll probably talk to that team, see if I can simulate the process for them. But it's going to be more than just, here are the steps of the IRB. I want them to actually write the proposal. I want them to collect the data. Or not necessarily collect the data, but I want them to go through and go through all the steps that are required and take a look at that timeline as well, so they don't get to their capstone and they're surprised or intimidated. The timeline, of course, again, spring second class year. So I have an example assignment I'm going to go through, and this would be the first week of class that we have. So the learning objectives for this assignment are to look at the free information practice principles that the federal government has described. So we have up here our required readings. We have an overview of the Privacy Act that the Justice Department has put together. That's like a very short, 5-paragraph history of the Privacy Act, and also talks about how these fair information practice principles were developed. We have another government site that actually goes into them and talks about them in depth. And we also have something like a legal conversation, or a legal overview of expectation of privacy in the Fourth Amendment. So that's going to kind of create our legal floor for the collection of data. So we'll start the class by going through those the fair information practice principles, applying them back and connecting them to some of the ethical foundations they learned in NE 203, going through that moral deliberation roadmap and connecting each of those principles, saying, okay, where do each of these kind of connect on here? But instead of just giving them to them, saying, hey, here's your ethical roadmap, and this is now what you believe. I want them to understand and to come to their conclusions, and to say, okay, we need to actually value them as well. Then we're going to go into the case study, which I have linked here. This is from the University of Hawaii, but it's a very popular case study. It just they had the best adaptation of it. When it comes time to class, I'm just going to have to seek out. I'm just going to have to get the permission to reproduce it. But they reproduced it from a software engineering ethics book. It's basically Google Street View cars. They got Google in trouble a decade ago because they were collecting Wi-Fi data and they were storing that data in a way that was freaking people out. Basically go through that case study and we have some questions like, okay, the Street View, so we're collecting data. So imagine besides the Wi-Fi stuff, just collecting data, taking pictures of public place. Are there ethical considerations on that? So we're starting from something that most people would consider to be ethically permissible, but looking at dipping our toes into saying, okay, how do you collect that data and also apply the fair information practice principles to those? Then consider the federal government was doing that instead of a private company. Does that change things? And then get into that Wi-Fi, some of the stuff that was more that people did not like as much. They were, eventually they were fined by the government, but that was more of a, they were blocking they were making they're blocking the justice. They weren't fined for the actual collection of the data. But using that case study, okay, so you are collecting this data. It is like actually people's private information that they thought it was private, but it's on a public Wi-Fi. It's not technically private. Anyways, going to those, applying those fair information practice principles to those, and then asking again, if this was the federal government, would it change things? And expecting them to make those connections and to make a differentiation between what's legal and what's ethical, and be able to apply those principles. And then this can be an in-class exercise, talk with the partner in depth, and then afterwards, it's going to be they're going to write it up and submit that as part of their portfolio for the class and individual effort. Anybody have any questions?
Thanks very much, Commander. Appreciate it. Okay, our fifth presentation today is from Professor Rick Ruth from the Naval Academy's, I'm sorry, I misspoke, from Professor Doug Vanderwerken from the Math Department. Please.
Hi, thank you for attending today. So I teach in the Math Department. I teach probability and statistics courses. And as part of this seminar, we learned about the ethics curriculum, the 4 classes, the ethics and leadership curriculum that the midshipmen take. And we were asked as an assignment to ponder about whether there were connections with or what connections there were between the ethics and leadership curriculum and our own curriculum. And so I thought about the class SM 339, which is applied statistics. It's a class that most of our math majors are required to take, and the others they can take it as an elective. Many of them are taking it in their junior year. And I saw a nice connection between what we do in this class and what the students are learning in their NL 310 leadership class. So that's a class they're taking in their junior year as well. And in there, they're studying leadership. And one thing that they study is the Challenger disaster. As many of you may be aware, this is a rocket ship that exploded shortly after takeoff, and the entire crew was killed. And what makes it all the more tragic is that there was good evidence before the launch that that part of the rocket system would fail because it was the temperature was lower on that day than it had been on previous successful days. And so they learn about this in their leadership course. But I recognize that at the same time that they're learning that, in our SM 339 course, we're studying a tool called logistic regression, which you can use to learn the probability of failure as a function of, say, temperature. And it so happens that we learn this in SM 339 right during that lull in the semester after Thanksgiving break, but before finals, where the students are, I won't speak for my students, but some other students across the yard might be less than enthused at this time of year. And this, I thought, would be a real fun, I shouldn't say fun, it's a serious matter, but it's an engaging problem for the students. Instead of some of the examples that we are currently using in that course were more mundane and just kind of boring, for lack of a better word. I should have thrown the current class. There's room for improvement there. And so I feel like there's a need that we have in our department to make this part of the curriculum more engaging. and I saw it as a good way to kind of bridge the gap between our disciplines. And so what I want the students to come away from this lecture from is I want them, first of all, to understand the challenge or disaster. They may have that already from their ethics course or their leadership course. But in addition to that, I want them to understand the statistical reasons in detail for why the launch should have been delayed. They have the tools. We will equip them with the tools to be able to articulate with statistical rigor, the probability of failure as a function of temperature. And so that they're coming at this problem from both sides, both the kind of the ethical considerations and the leadership aspect, but also they're being equipped with the technical expertise to as if they were the engineers in that problem, in that situation. I also do want them to come away from this lecture appreciating that those in leadership positions did have values of their own, that they were or competing interests with the idea of wanting to stay on schedule with public relations considerations. Those matter, but they shouldn't have mattered nearly as much as the technical problems mattered. And so I want them to be able to consider but disregard in the end the public relation aspect of this. I also want to give them practice in written communication, in conveying to a superior the direness of the situation with statistical rigor, but also recognizing that their audience might not be as statistically well versed as they are. And so I give as an assignment, I plan to give as an assignment the assignment to write a memo as if you were an engineer that conveys to your superior the critical nature of this problem, and really I want them to display the urgency in that memo that is befitting of the situation. The way that I want to go about this in class, there's a nice PBS video about the disaster. Based on what Howard said, we might have them watch this before they come to class, so we have more time in class for discussion. But then in class, we'll investigate the actual data set. We'll talk about what the data say. I do want them to consider the ethical obligations that an analyst has. Do they have obligations beyond briefing the decision maker? And when I say brief, I suppose you could imagine this going different ways. They could write their memo that they have to write just as a kind of informational memo to say, here are the pros, here are the cons of the decision, and you're invested with that decision-making authority, and go make a decision. That's one way to do it. On the other hand, and I think this is the more appropriate route, they could instill or they could urge the decision maker in the direction of delay. And so I tend to grade them on how well they express that urgency. I do want to say, just spend a moment on the title. So I've titled this lecture that I intend to give, Challenging Authority. And there's obviously a pun with the name of the rocket ship, which will help them remember this. And then there's I think what I see as the kind of the first level reading here, the obvious interpretation, which is that they, as an engineer or as a statistician in an organization, might have to challenge the authority that's the decision maker that's set above them. But I also want them to come away from this with a second meaning of this phrase, challenging authority, and that is that when you have authority, it can be challenging. There's a burden of leadership, and these analysts in this problem or in this situation, by virtue of their knowledge, they were endowed with authority, not decision-making authority, but authority of some kind, because they knew when other people didn't know, and that gave them moral obligations. And so it's challenging to meet those obligations. And so I want them to understand that authority, no matter how we get that authority, whether it's by virtue of our knowledge or by virtue of our position, is a challenge. And that's something that needs to be grappled with. It can be a terrible burden, the burden of leadership, but it's something that they need to, as leaders, be, come to terms with and be prepared to act. I also want them to recognize that in their position in the fleet, they will likely be decision makers, not just analysts. Sometimes they'll be analysts, but sometimes they'll be the decision makers, and they need to have, I think, a humility and an appreciation for the fact that they don't know everything and that they need to pay attention to their subordinates, maybe more than, certainly more than was the subordinates were paid attention to in this instance. So that's my plan. I have some next steps going forward. I want to familiarize myself more with the Challenger data set and this problem. But that's my vision for this lecture. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor. Before we introduce our last speaker, we'd like to ask people in cyberspace and here in the room if they have any comments or questions to go ahead and prepare them. If you're in cyberspace, please send it to us via chat. We'll end the formal presentations at the top of the hour as scheduled, and then our speakers will hang out here for any further discussion. So with that, our final speaker today is Professor Rick Ruth from the Naval Academy History Department. Professor?
Thanks a lot, Jeff. And actually, before I begin, I want to thank Jeff and Doug and Mike, Marcus, Mark, Shirley, and for all their help in putting together the workshop, and to all the people beyond this room who've made it possible, and to my fellow participants for their generosity and their fellowship and their assistance these last few days. So I'm a professor of Asian history, and I teach HH 215A, which is one of our core courses. It's pre-modern world history. My emphasis is on, or centers it on Asia, on India, China, Japan, Southeast Asia. And when I first started teaching many years ago, I asked how to set the class up and how much freedom I had in designing it. And my chair at the time told me I could do whatever I wanted within those parameters of time and geography. But he told me to emphasize ethics. And I think this was still a kind of holdover to the double E cheating scandal many years ago, that we were supposed to use some of these core classes to emphasize ethics. And what I did for many years was to, in addition to studying history from about 500 BC up until 1750, was to introduce the most influential Asian ethical traditions as we studied these dynasties and empires and states and great figures that emerged. And what I did over the years often was I would ask the students to take some of these traditions and apply them to the Naval Academy. So I'd ask them to compare the common competing Chinese philosophical traditions of Confucianism and legalism, and say, is the Naval Academy more like a Confucian school where you're supposed to model virtue, and that there are social hierarchies and you're dedicated to developing yourself and that kind of thing? Or is it more like a legalist school that has kind of strict punishments that are equally applied for all kinds of infractions or regardless of your social status? And it was a kind of an abstract experiment that they did, and it showed me whether they were learning it or not, and trying to get them to think about it in a different context. And I think recently the problem was it occurred to me that's all it was, that they were just thinking about it abstractly and they're applying it abstractly, and it also gave them a chance for a little while to engage with the Naval Academy, and then they would forget about it. So we'd apply it to mid-regs, or we'd apply it to Fleet Summer or something like that. And I think this year, almost at the last minute, after my syllabus had been made, it occurred to me with the Sager report that came out that we could take some of these Asian philosophical traditions and apply it to a particular problem or something that's bedeviling us at the time. And so what I developed was a project, and I had a kind of trial run of it in the spring that I want to do more with. The students did what I always have them do. They take these Asian philosophical traditions, they try to learn about them, try to recognize them, should be able to explain them. And I kind of want them to separate the ideas from the foreign terms and the foreign figures and take them for what they are: benevolence, non-attachment, demonstrating virtue, all of those kinds of things separate from the kind of Asian vocabulary that we sometimes have with it. And then apply them to, as I said, the problems either institutional or personal or even national as we think about this. So they learn them, they are tested on them in a test for their 6th grade. We spend a semester, as we talk about history or learn about history, we talk about them and they talk about the reflections with them. And then they'll write an essay toward the end of the semester where we might apply them to something going on. And I set the SAGR survey this year, but it could be things like morale, or it could be a losing sports team. I had a student who was on a sports team that only won 1 game this year, and I overheard them one day sort of joking about it with her in the class, and it occurred to me there are all kinds of situations that we could apply it to. My short-term goal, of course, is I want them to learn Asian history and philosophical traditions. A little bit beyond that, I want them to be able to make the Naval Academy a little bit better and to make their time a little bit better here. And then the long-term goal is I hope that they'll take these ideas, put them in their emotional and leadership toolboxes that they take with them out into the fleet, out into American society, and use those to make them better. And I'll kind of wind up quickly here by showing some of this is me refining a project I started. But my homework is I plan to kind of work on the assignment, try to give them a chance to develop it more fully. But I also realized these last few days is that I did not know enough about how we taught ethics here. As I said earlier, today I was under the impression we had 1 single term class on ethics, and the class on leadership was something separate, and the class on law was something separate from that, without realizing the degree to which ethics is a continuum here for all their 4 years here. So I'm going to learn more about that so that I can sync what I'm teaching in my history core class with what they're hearing. My students occasionally will mention Stoicism or Aristotle, and realize I don't know enough about those philosophical traditions to be able to help them contextualize what I'm teaching them. So my plan is to continue with this. I'm going to teach this class again in the spring of 2024. And I hope next year to have some kind of assessment report prepared to say whether I was able to carry some of these things out. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Professor Ruth, and thanks to all the participants here in this year's Ethics Across the Curriculum and the Yard workshop. As we wrap things up, we'd like to express our thanks again to our donors, the Robert and Mary Looker Foundation and the Noggle Ingersoll families for their generous support of this program through the Naval Academy Foundation. And in something this wide-reaching, we have a number of people who played very substantial roles that we'd like to acknowledge. Professor Karen Sproles, the director of the Naval Academy Center for Teaching and Learning. Thanks very much. She has been an instrumental part of this program from its inception, as has Professor Allison Webster Giddings. Lieutenant Commander Lauren Crone and Lieutenant Commander Jennifer Howell from the chaplain's office have administered and managed this year's program with great success. We pass our thanks to them. From the Leadership, Ethics, and Law Department, Dr. Doug Rao, Professor Marcus Hedall, and Dr. Michael Good were subject matter experts in providing an overview of the leadership curriculum, as well as a particularly close look at the way we teach ethics. We have Professor Shirley Lynn and Professor Mark McWilliams, who are both experienced in academic assessment, and they led our discussion of academic assessment in the cognitive, in the behavioral or psychomotor, and the affective domains of learning. All of our lead course directors, Ms. Sarah White provided financial support in providing stipends for everyone else. So for everyone who participated, including our donors, our participants, and our facilitators, we provide our thank you. So at this point, we'd like to open the floor up to any comments or questions from people here assembled in the room or in cyberspace. Please feel free to jump in. Please, Patrick.
I was just thinking the Challenger case kind of, and then the data visualization piece kind of both hooked up into a single scenario. I don't know if people are familiar with Edwin Tufte's The Cognitive Style of PowerPoint. So he's a statistician that sort of talks about specifically the visualization of data. And he has a case in that book that's not about the Challenger disaster, but about the Columbia disaster. And so it's the same sort of thing. There is a risk factor that they're trying to evaluate in this case, the possibility that the penetrations of the heat shield were sufficiently large as to endanger the shuttle. And he actually brings up the PowerPoint slide that the JPL or Boeing, I can't remember, JPL engineers presented on the risks of possible reentry without repairing the heat shield. And he makes two arguments. One, that they systematically underplayed the risks and made serious statistical and engineering errors. But the second thing that he mentions is that the cognitive display style of PowerPoint actually contributed to those errors. In other words, they'd have the big sort of like happy line was at the top, and then all of the subsequent qualifications got smaller and smaller as a result of the sort of default architecture of PowerPoint. And so I think this might connect to, this might be an interesting case where there was a lack of courage, but there was also a structural feature in how the data was visualized that contributed to the failure. And so I thought that'd be an interesting kind of way of connecting the data visualization discussion, or how to present data, which ultimately what PowerPoint is doing, is it's presenting data in a certain sort of way, and then also the sort of like the ethics of providing engineering advice and stuff like that, which I think was a failure in both cases. It also will get you to use PowerPoint a whole lot less, which I think is way better for everybody involved. So I was just thinking, so this is the case that kind of popped into my head, and it's an excellent book, but I think the case is right there, and I think would be something that you could kind of put on top of the Challenger, or maybe do like the next level, because I think the engineering challenges or the engineering evaluation was tougher in that particular case, but also the failures are now going to be clearly sort of connected to the sort of normal practices of how the data and how the conclusions were presented.
The title of the book again?
So it's Edwin Tufte, Tufte, and it's called he has a couple of different books, but the one I was thinking was The Cognitive Style of PowerPoint. It's pretty short. It's like a $5 ebook, but he has like a longer one. It's called The Visual Display of Information or something like that. That's kind of a classic in the field. But the case is in Cognitive Style of PowerPoint.
Comments or questions? Okay, if not, then we'll conclude this year's 2023 Ethics Across the Curriculum in the Yard workshop. Thanks to everyone. We appreciate it, and we hope this will foster continued engagement with the subject of ethics in the classroom, on the sports fields, and in Bancroft Hall. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm familiar with Aaron Abbey.
Yes,
Never know myself as a fan or not.
Fantastic.
I think he has, like,